Something happened there.
Come
Ah,
on. I'm working on it.
just hit. Yeah, we gotta go back to slideshow. There, what do you see? So, as Jesus wants us to look at the world and understand and interpret it, what are you seeing? What kind of headlines do we see in the world today? Harvey? Scary ones. Yeah. There's lots of scary stuff in the world, isn't there? Stuff happening, locally, nationally, globally. You almost don't want to even watch the news. I have a niece that won't even let her kids listen to it. She says, I don't want them to hear all this stuff. Anyway, you can understand that, can't you? Yeah. But on the other hand, we can't be the proverbial ostrich with our head in the sand, can we? We can't be ignorant of what's happening. So what kinds of things are we seeing? Senseless murders. So there's violence. Okay. West Coast is on fire. So there's natural kinds of disasters going on. Okay. Kidnappings. Floods. Yep. So, regardless of what you may think as a cause, something's happening with the climate. Okay? Christians persecuted. On a scale that we have not seen or heard before. I mean, on an occasion, there's some tribe might, back in 50 years ago or so, the missionaries were martyred in Ecuador. But this is on a different scale now. Okay? When you hear of whole groups of Christians being marched to a beach and beheaded simply because they're Christians. Refugees right now, yeah. This is current event stuff, isn't it? Mass refugee exodus out of Syria. And of course, we've been dealing with this as a Free Methodist Church. We have an extensive refugee work in Jordan of Syrian refugees, and we are trying to minister to them. This is stuff that's happening right now.
Human trafficking.
Okay, human trafficking. Okay, yeah. What Isaiah said, be careful when right becomes wrong and wrong becomes right, and moral confusion. Okay? All right. Well, one of the things that, we mentioned this, is terrorism. And that seems to be constantly in the news. And Arab Islamic fundamentalism. It seems like just hardly a week goes by where you don't hear something about some act of violence, some terrorist act, or a threat of a terrorist act. And we are facing a world in which this has become almost a daily reality for us. We are chronically orange, danger threat level orange. I don't know that we will ever in our lifetime get off of orange into green again. We're going to bounce back and forth between orange and red, it seems. And orange is going to be about as good as it's going to get. But that threat is constant. And it's really a new development. It's something that we didn't use when we were kids. Most of us were kids. We never thought of terrorism. There may have been a war here or there, but not like this. So this is something that's rather new. And so what are we to make of that? And that's what the topic of this study is going to be about. It's about looking at Islam, ISIS, and Jesus. Because frankly, most of the terrorism that we're looking at in the world today is being propagated by those who are doing it in the name of Allah. And they're doing it as what they would consider to be an act of righteousness. They're doing it for God as they understand God. And most recently, we have the development of this thing called ISIS in the Middle East, in which their goal is not just simply to be a terrorist organization. Their goal is to actually form a universal Islamic nation. And go ahead. The caliphate, okay, that's the term. Yeah. So, and the word caliphate is their term for an Arab empire. Okay, it's a universal empire, and their goal, and we'll look more deeply into this in the weeks ahead, but their goal is to establish a government based on Sharia law that would be very extensive and would encompass all of the Middle East, much of Europe, and into Asia at a minimum. And that's what they're talking about when they're talking about a caliphate. Okay? And but we'll get more into that here shortly. And then how does that relate to Jesus? As we okay. There. So in order to understand all of that, we really need to look at Islam. The basis of, the caliphate is an Islamic republic, is what they're looking for. So there's no way to separate this and call it something. It's well beyond just even Arab. It's Islamic. And so where did Islam come from? Islam today is the fastest growing religion in the world. It's outstripping Christianity by significant margins. Part of that growth is just natural birth. They're having babies quicker than we are. It's just sheer numbers. When you have a birth rate in Europe that is down to close to 1 for every 2 adults, their population, Christian-based population in Europe is shrinking, but the Muslim population is exponentially growing. They're just having a lot more kids, and eventually that's going to create a shift in the population.
We also have a lot more wives, so you can have kids like multiple.
In some places they do that. Okay? Islam is growing 4 times faster than Christianity in the world today. Within 25 years, it will be the dominant religion of Europe. Already, I think it's in France, one in 10 are Muslims. So they're already 10%, and at the rate we're going. In England today, already, there are more Muslims attending weekly services in the mosque than there are Christians attending services in the Church of England. They've already surpassed the Church of England in terms of weekly attendance. Islam is the fastest growing religion here in the U.S. That may come as a shock. This is even more shocking. 80% of the converts to Islam in the U.S. were raised in Christian churches. That's where their most fertile ground is. And they're similar in approach to many of the cults. The cults don't go after atheists, they go after Christians. People who already have a faith in God. And what Islam is doing is providing a way to believe in God without believing in all of the things that we teach about Jesus. And it's very popular today to say Jesus was a good man, but he wasn't God. And that's exactly what Islam is saying. In fact, Islam accepts Jesus as a prophet. He's one of the prophets. But they vehemently deny his divinity. And that appeals to a great number of people who have had Christian training. 85% of the U.S. converts are in the inner cities. They're among ethnic groups. By 2020, most urban American centers will be predominantly Muslim. You know, that's only 5 years away. And that's what I just like, that can't be, that cannot possibly be. You know, it just doesn't seem that possible. But if trends continue, that's what they're telling us. Okay? And ISIS is actually gaining support throughout the Middle East. Despite all of our efforts to try to squash ISIS, they are getting recruits by the thousands. And they're coming from all over the world. And we've had, again, in the news, we've had people from Western countries, throughout Europe, even the U.S., traveling to the Middle East to hook up and be part of ISIS. Somehow they have caught the vision of what ISIS is all about, and they want to be part of it. Okay, so who was Muhammad? Muhammad is the father of Islam. And in order to really understand Islam, you have to go back to their beginnings. He was born in 570 AD, so that puts him, clearly after Jesus, after Paul, after the early church, after the church became the official religion of Rome, after Rome, in essence, fell, and the center of the Roman Empire shifted to Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, Turkey. So after all of that, Muhammad arrived on the scene in Arabia. At the time, Arabia was an area where there were just many different Arab tribes, Bedouin kinds of tribes. There were some cities in Arabia, but they were led by these Arab tribes, and they all feuded with one another. Arabia was part of a trade route from east to west, and these tribes prospered based on the trade route, and much of it was from raiding the caravans. They were thieves, and they stole from one another. They would raid one another. And so there was all this feuding going on, and this tribal rivalry going on, and Muhammad came on the scene, and he was orphaned at the age of 6. He was adopted by his uncle, who was a caravan trader, and so that took him all through the Arabian Peninsula, where he was exposed to all these different tribes. There were Jews in Arabia, there were Christians in Arabia, and so they gave him wide exposure to much of the world in that area at the time. As a young man, once he grew up, he became a very well-respected merchant in Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia now. So he's very successful. He had a reputation of being a good and honest man. And in his work, he met a wealthy woman who was significantly older than him, and her name was Khadijah. And Khadijah actually proposed marriage to Muhammad. That was not the custom. A very unusual thing, but Muhammad was a young man, and so this older woman proposed marriage, and they got married, and it proved to be a very good marriage. It lasted until her death, and she was the only wife that Muhammad had during that time, until her death. Khadijah was the first to believe Muhammad was a prophet of God. Muhammad was a very devout religious person. Much of the Arab religion in the time was pagan. Each of the tribes had their own god that they worshipped. And Muhammad worshipped the main god of his tribe, which was Allah. And he became very devout in that, and he regularly would take retreats. He would retreat to a cave in which he would seek to spend time with God in prayer and deepen his relationship with God as he understood him from his tribal training. So, what happened was, in these retreat times, Muhammad began to have visions. He would come back, tell Khadijah about the visions. They terrified him, actually. And he thought, in his own mind, he thought he was being demon-possessed. But Khadijah convinced him that no, in fact, that these were visions from God, and that he was a prophet. And so with that encouragement, he pursued becoming a prophet. So Islam did not exist when the Bible was written. It came about following the formation and the canonization of the New Testament. Okay, he was a spiritual man. And in 610 is when he received the first vision. And supposedly it was the angel Gabriel who appeared to him and told him to recite. And as the story goes, he kept saying, I can't recite. He claimed to have been illiterate, and therefore wasn't able to recite. But he was supposed to repeat what was told to him. He was told 3 times, and he kept resisting until finally he started to recite. The word for the Quran means the recitation. So that's where the Quran comes from. Quran is this message that he received, that he recited and then recorded. Okay? When you read the Quran, it reads a lot like maybe Proverbs. It's not like our Bible in that there aren't stories in the Quran in the same sense of like the gospel tells us stories of Jesus and what he did. Most of the Quran is simply spiritual sayings. Much of what is in the Quran could actually be found in other places, though the Muslims will vehemently deny that. They say this was original with Muhammad, given by God himself, and it came from no other source. But it's curiously similar to some of the things that were current in the day. They were supposedly original. I've already covered that. The visions were terrifying to Muhammad. Covered that. And so when Muhammad begins to take this message and he goes to Mecca and he begins to preach it in the public squares, opposition rises quickly. Thank you.
It's coffee.
Uh-oh.
I was gonna get your water, but it sounded like you better not spill it.
Okay, opposition rose quickly from the ruling tribal leaders. Now, why would they be opposed? One of Muhammad's main messages is that there is only one God. And that flies in the face of all of the tribal gods. And at the time, actually, currently, I think we are in Ramadan or about to enter Ramadan. And does anybody know what happens in Ramadan? We have the Hajj. What's the Hajj? Anybody know what the Hajj is?
They'll go to Mecca and they'll meet in this big area. There's a great big stone in the middle and they all march around it. And what they do that for, I don't know.
Okay. All right. That is the Hajj. And that big square boxy thing that they walk around was already at Mecca, was already part of the tribal religion, and in that were stones representing all of the different tribal gods. So it was a pagan altar. And So when Muhammad shows up and he says, all of those are false gods and there's only one God, and Allah was one of the gods that they had in their midst, but Muhammad is saying he's the only one. It upset a few people. And it upset the tribal leaders. And the tribal leaders were the wealthy people, and they were prospering from this whole system. And so Muhammad was a real threat. And so persecution against Muhammad rose very quickly, and they considered him to be a crazy guy. And they ridiculed him and ridiculed his followers. And at this point, his followers consisted basically of his family and his closest friends. It's the only body that was paying any attention and giving Muhammad any kind of credibility at all. Okay, like Judaism, Islam has a wealth of other interpretive writings that have cropped up. They're also considered to be authoritative. They're called the Hadith literature. Excuse me.
Do you want water?
Yeah, water break would be better. And Islam also has an eschatology about end times. You may not have realized that. They love to study prophecy as well. Much of what they believe about end times and prophecy has come from the Hadith literature. Okay, what is the Hadith literature? The Hadith literature is the interpretive commentary on the Quran. And that has come to have an authority similar to the Quran. Not quite, but close. Okay, so what did Muhammad then preach? There's only one God, I think, the God of Ibrahim, and that is simply the Arabic pronunciation for Abraham. Okay? So, he taught that pagan gods must be forsaken, the prayers should be frequent, and the poor must be treated justly. Okay, again, the rich didn't want to hear about poor being treated justly. They were in a position of advantage, and they wanted to keep things just the way they were. And Muhammad advocated treating the poor with respect and with a degree of equality that ran against the culture of his day. So you look at that and, you say, that's not bad. There's much there that, we believe in the God of Abraham. We're not in favor of pagan gods. We believe in prayer, frequent prayer. And Jesus talked about treating the poor justly. And so we say, there's a lot here that we could embrace. And Muhammad really expected to get the support of the Jews and the Christians. Because what he thought he was saying was not that far different than what Jews and Christians had been saying before. In fact, it was much closer to Judaism and Christianity than what he had been taught as a boy growing up in a pagan society. Right? He taught that all should be chaste toward the opposite sex. Okay, we wouldn't have any argument with that, would we? Oh. Okay. that there should be honesty, should govern all business affairs. It was a common practice in his day that girls would be aborted, or baby girls abandoned to die. And he said that's wrong. Again, we wouldn't have any argument with that. That God will judge those who do wrong in hell. All right? Probably true. You know, we go along with that. And that God will reward those who do right in paradise. Okay? That's where you start to get a little difference here in Christianity. Basically, Islam is a works righteousness religion. Everything depends on your being or becoming a good enough person by obeying Sharia law. Sharia law simply means God's law, as they understand it. And if you are a just and good person, your reward for being just and good is to go to paradise. Okay? And if you are not, you go to hell. Now as we know, there are certain promises that they believe that if you die for the cause of Allah, that's martyrdom is a guaranteed ticket to paradise. And that's what many of the terrorists are counting on. So that's basically, that was Muhammad's message as he started to preach. And again, much of it wasn't anything we could really argue with too much here. So what was the response? He was mocked as a crazy man, rejected by tribal leaders. Arab tribes each had their own tribal gods. We've covered some of this already. As his followers grew, so did the persecution. And so, remember in 610 is when he started having his vision. So 5 years later, he has had enough followers and they're getting persecuted, and for their safety, he sends a group of them to Ethiopia. And there, in Ethiopia, he seeks the protection of a Christian king who grants them to come and who does provide some protection for Muhammad's followers. He was hoping that the Christian king would become a follower himself, but that didn't happen. Persecution continued for Muhammad, who stayed in Mecca. Khadijah died in 619, 9 years after he started having his visions. So that gives you a little history here of Muhammad and how Islam got started. Now, one of the holy sites in Islam is Jerusalem. So far, we haven't said anything about Jerusalem. So how does Jerusalem become a holy city? Well, in 620, shortly after Khadijah dies, Muhammad has another vision, a revelation, and in his revelation, Gabriel takes him to Jerusalem. Now, there's some debate in the Muslim world whether this was simply a vision or whether he physically, literally was transported to Jerusalem. Probably more people believe he was actually physically transported there, bodily. Okay, as part of the journey, he was taken to hell, And then he also went to heaven. And according to the Quran, he went to the seventh heaven where God spoke to him directly. Along the way, he spoke with many of the Jewish prophets, including Jesus. And in heaven, God spoke to Muhammad and supposedly affirmed him as his prophet. And he was told to take his message to all nations and not just to the Arabs. Up to this point, this has been basically an Arab thing. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque marks the place from which Muhammad supposedly was taken to heaven. And so that's why that site on the Temple Mount and that mosque is so holy to Islam. It's the closest thing that Islam has a shrine to Muhammad. They're generally pretty anti-shrines. They're anti-images. That's why when there are cartoon depictions and Muhammad is actually depicted in any kind of visual way, there's a hue and cry because Muhammad was not supposed to have any kind of image of him so that he didn't become an idol, so to speak. Yes.
What's the seventh heaven?
Okay, Paul talks about the seventh heaven in 2 Corinthians, where he says he was taken to the seventh heaven, and it was in the cosmology of the day. It was kind of understood that the sky was one level of heaven, and then you're above the sky, and so there's these levels of heaven, and you get to the highest level, and that's where God is. Okay, and that's where that comes from. The point was that he went to the highest heaven and actually appeared before the throne of God.
Follow back to the third heaven.
Oh, third, that's right. As I said that, yeah, maybe that Paul was in third heaven, not seventh heaven. But in their understanding of the universe, there was 7 levels. And I can't tell you what all the 7 levels were. But you're right. Paul talked about going to the third heaven. So how did Islam gain control of Arabia? Well, all of these feuding tribes, there were those that were in Medina, what is now Medina. It had a different name at the time, but we know it today as Medina. They asked Muhammad to come because by this time they had heard of Muhammad, and he had a reputation for being a wise and just man. And so they asked, come and help us to sort out all of our feuding and fighting. And so they invited him to come and mediate their differences. He left Mecca. He took his followers with him. He did it secretly, a few at a time, so that the leaders in Mecca would not know about it. So they slipped away, and when he got to Medina, he was able to negotiate and mediate a peace, and as part of that, he wrote a civil constitution and set up a government to bring law and order to Medina. So what happened in the process, because he was the one instrumental in doing that, they basically made him the ruler. A position which he gladly accepted. And so he became the political and spiritual leader of Medina. Now that is extremely, extremely important. Because we have to understand that in Islam, this is not a religion that is simply a personal spiritual experience. That from the very beginnings of Islam, there was a political side. And that part of being a follower of Muhammad is that you embrace the concept that there will be a government that will embrace Muhammad, and that the whole society will embrace what Muhammad has written in the Quran, and that becomes the rule of law, the basis for law, and that you cannot separate an Islamic government from Islam. It is part of the package. And so Muhammad becomes this political leader, and over time he's able to weaken his enemies in Mecca. There are feuds that go back and forth. There are attempts by the tribes of Mecca to come and attack Muhammad and the people of Medina. They're thwarted, and eventually Muhammad is able to form alliances with the other tribes. One way he does it is by marrying, okay, taking a page from Europe. You get enough intermarriages, and the marriages, if we form an alliance here, you get a wife, and if you have my daughter, you know I won't attack you. So these alliances are formed, and slowly, little by little, Muhammad is able to get all of these different tribes to the point where Mecca is pretty well isolated by themselves, and they're an island in the Sea of Arabia, where the rest of Arabia has now allied itself with Muhammad. And there comes a showdown, and Muhammad, by overwhelming strength, marches on Mecca, and they surrender. They know there is no way that they can resist Muhammad. And so Muhammad becomes the de facto leader of all of Arabia. And after that happens, he comes to Mecca for the Hajj, and at the Hajj, he removes all of the pagan images, and I forget what they call it, it's, the square thing, it becomes Allah's shrine. It's his place, his center of worship, and all prayers now are spoken toward Mecca, because that's where Allah's center of power now is. He delivers his last message in Mecca before his death in 632 AD. And that message becomes very important as Islam develops over the centuries. So by this time, the entire Arab world has become a follower of Muhammad, and we have the very first caliphate. And that's where the yearning and the desire for the caliphate comes from. This is at the very root of what Islam is all about. This is what they are seeking to restore. The glory days in which Muhammad ruled the Middle East as the leader. And the Quran was followed, and the beginnings of Sharia law began. Because the Quran doesn't explain everything, at this point, they begin to work out in these interpretive writings. Okay, how do we live by the Quran? And so Sharia law is beginning to now be written, not by Muhammad, but by his followers. All right, any questions on what we've covered so far? Today was basically kind of history.